How about Chris?
Afternoon, Steve. I met you a number of years ago. I used to work in Hudson Highlands State Park. I was a land steward over there. I think I met you on a number of occasions, but I am for this project. I am representing a Millbrook in the town of Washington in Dutchess County.
Great. Good to see you, Chris.
Good to see you again.
Anya. Oops, you're muted, Anya.
Sorry about that. I was just saying hi, Steve. I'm Anya. I'm representing the town of Calvert and village of Philmont. I'm definitely interested to hear about housing and conservation and how they intersect.
Great. Welcome.
Let's see. Anybody else? Well, we'll just give it another couple minutes to let people come on in. Um, Bradley, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Um, I don't represent any town, but I'm on I guess, the developer side. Uh, and I'm in partnership with Meredith Kane. Steve, I think you know Meredith. So we're working on a regenerative farm with affordable housing. So very much conservation and affordable housing oriented.
Amazing.
Great. Thank you.
How about Stephanie Lazar?
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I am in the town of Ghent and I sit on the planning board. And I'm also a member of the.
Oops, did we lose her? How about Christina Bonesack?
I am Christina. I'm not actually in this cohort, but I am an alum of some great PCA programs from the town of Germantown. And I also am the co-director of the Capital Region Clean Energy Hub, which is run by the Albany Affordable Housing Project. So
Great, thanks, Christina. How about Anne Wyborowski? Wyborowski. Hope I pronounced that right.
You did good.
Maybe she's not there.
I'm here. Hi. Sorry. I'm having a little trouble with my camera and I thought I spacebar unmuted, but obviously not. Hi, I'm Ann Wiborowski. I'm part of the core group with Lisa Hintz on the Funding Futures group as the Voices of Woodbury. And I'm also involved with some Orange Environment, an environmental organization in Orange County. And I'm really glad to be here with everybody today and eager to learn quite a bit. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Anne.
You're welcome.
Um, well, I see we're at 5 past, so if anybody else would like to introduce themselves, maybe follow suit as Simon did and put your little bio in the chat. And we'll go ahead and get started. We are recording this session, so we will have that up on Partners for Climate Action's YouTube in case you want to refer back to it. So Paige, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Um, so welcome everyone. I'm Paige Ruane. I'm the co-director of the Funding Futures program along with Vanessa, my colleague Vanessa Bertozzi. And we want to welcome you to this special session of the Funding Futures program. We've opened it up to the public. And just to explain what Funding Futures is, it's a new grant and training program from PCA that guides 6 Hudson Valley Fellows. And we've awarded them funding to run a community listening campaign in their towns to understand what people care about when it comes to their place in the local environment. And the process includes events, outreach, a town-wide ballot, and a prioritization process to determine which projects the community really wants to see. Vanessa and I also bring the cohort of 6 Funding Futures Fellows together for weekly guest speakers and peer-to-peer support.
And so for this session, we decided to open it up to more than just the cohort, and we're so glad to see so many folks interested in joining us today. At PCA, we believe that the overlapping ecological crises are best addressed by communities that are closest to them and by using approaches that honor the uniqueness of each place. So our guest today is Steve Rosenberg. He is the co-convener of the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. Steve is the former Senior Vice President of Scenic Hudson and the Executive Director of the Scenic Hudson Land Trust. Steve served on the board of the Land Trust Alliance for 9 years. Hold on, just letting more people in. He has led many efforts bringing land, equity, and conservation together at a regional scale, including authoring the New York City Hudson Valley Foodshed Conservation Plan, launching Scenic Hudson's River Cities program, and leading efforts to transform Hudson River post-industrial waterfronts into safe and inviting public places. So we were drawn to Steve's work at the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation because this group brings such groundbreaking work together and bringing together experts from sectors that often seem opposed. Developers and housing advocates on one side, conservationists, environmentalists on the other. And it's so unique to grapple with this tension head on and acknowledge perspectives from all sides and come together to find a mutually beneficial path forward. So with that, we're thrilled to be hosting Steve today, and I'm just going to share my screen so that we can see his slides. Hold on one moment, please. All right, is that working for everybody? Great. All right.
Thank you, Vanessa. All good there?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Partners for Climate Action. And thank you, all of you who are taking the time to participate today. Looking forward to sharing with you and then hearing your questions and having some discussion afterwards. Next slide, please. So as Vanessa said, and it sort of frames the organizing principle of our work at the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. Healthy, sustainable communities need both. They need abundant, affordable housing, and we can talk a little bit. I'll be happy to answer questions about what is affordable housing. And communities also need protected land for clean water and food production and climate resilience, but too often they're seen as either mutually exclusive, people just don't think of them in the same breath or thought, or unfortunately, worst case, it's not uncommon for them to be thought of as being opposed to one another. Next slide, please. And so hardly a day goes by, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the headlines, the op-ed pieces, the social media pieces that focus on either the housing crisis, not just here in the Hudson Valley, but all over the country, or the climate crisis. And we see skyrocketing housing prices. I just learned last week, for example, that in Columbia County, the new median house sales price was $679,000, up 14.1% from the year before, just as one example. We see increasingly fragmented landscapes. Sometimes I think we're thrown off of what's really happening with the landscape that surrounds us in the Hudson Valley, because as we drive on the rural roads, we see green bucolic landscapes when in fact the zoning and the subdivisions that have already occurred and that are continue to slice it up into much smaller parcels that incrementally are being developed over time. And again, it may look green, but the landscape from a biodiversity, resilience, and water quality and agricultural perspective is increasingly put at risk. And then finally, we're all so familiar with the increasing impacts of climate change, flooding, storm surge, and recently was talking about someone who had studied incoming new residents to the Hudson Valley, and what a large percentage of them, not a majority, but an increasingly large percentage of them, are coming from California to escape fire risk. Next slide, please. So among the challenges to addressing these crises, both the climate crisis and the crisis in housing affordability, and I think of that as housing that ordinary people can actually afford, are a few things. One of them, well, lots of things, but the fact that public policy and public funding programs and philanthropic funding programs are typically completely siloed. So you will have programs that support each sector, and I like to think of them as two sectors as opposed to sides. But they're all sort of created as all or nothing programs. So if you're, for example, a land conservation organization, and there's a large parcel of land that's available and it meets your criteria for conservation because of different conservation values it has, but perhaps some portion of it would be better suited or would be particularly well suited for an affordable housing development or some other important public need. Unfortunately, the funding that is available, typically either through philanthropic sources or public programs, is all or nothing. So you can acquire and conserve that land in total and forego the opportunity to achieve other public needs in the community that don't necessarily undermine your conservation objectives, or you can't get the funding at all. Similarly, in the affordable housing community, affordable housing developers understand and want their residents to have access to open space, to trails, to community gardens. And the funding that they get is typically in the form of either tax credits or subsidies to underwrite the construction cost of the units, but they have no opportunity to secure funds typically, and certainly don't have the capability and the expertise to develop public spaces, local farms, trails, and other assets that would benefit the residents of their projects. Also, we know that while we all think about the objective of being strategic with our land conservation work and thinking at a broader scale, realities of the day mean that we often work on a parcel by parcel approach, the result of which can sometimes, from a conservation perspective, be what I call patchwork conservation. So maybe 15, 20 years later, instead of seeing a large connected assemblage of conservation lands that have value and can create connectivity corridors for wildlife, climate resilience, protecting water supplies, we end up with a disconnected, more ad hoc collection of conserved parcels that don't necessarily achieve the kind of long-term conservation benefits that we hope for. And then, of course, on top of these concerns we talked about already, the two sectors typically don't know each other, let alone work together, and oftentimes, not just in the Hudson Valley, but around the country, view each other with some element of suspicion, mistrust, and sort of armed with a lot of unfortunate mythology about what the other one is about. Next slide, please. So after I stepped down from my position at Scenic Hudson, I sort of looked back at my own personal long-term interest in this issue of being the lack of intersection typically between the affordable housing sector and the land conservation sector. My interest had been piqued initially back in the early 90s when I learned about the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which is a sort of quasi-public entity that was created through the advocacy of both sectors in Vermont to provide funding for projects in both sectors. And in 2006, in my own community of Rhinebeck, I asked the town board if they would let me launch an open space and affordable housing committee, which they did, and for which we created a series of recommendations. So had those experiences in the back of my mind. And then very coincidentally and fortunately, I was introduced to an affordable housing professional named Rebecca Gillman Crimmins, who grew up in the Hudson Valley and now works for a large supportive housing organization in New York City. And she and I came up with this structure for what is now the Hudson Valley Alliance for Housing and Conservation. Next slide, please. So we decided initially, and it's still the case, that we wanted to focus on the nonprofit organizations. For those of you who aren't familiar, in the affordable housing world, there are both nonprofit affordable housing developers and for-profit affordable housing developers. And so we invited 5 organizations from each sector to come together with the idea of initially building relationships and trust, debunking myths, sharing information to try to cut through this divide that has existed for so long. The organizations in the Alliance, there are now 16 of them, cover 6 counties. They work in 6 counties. It was important for us to ensure that the organizations are working in a range of urban, suburban, and rural geographies. We knew, especially at the beginning, that because there was this mistrust, there was baggage, there was a lot of unpacking to do, that it would be valuable to have a neutral facilitator that could work with the individuals representing the organizations in both sectors to work through these issues in a careful and sensitive way. And we brought in the Consensus Building Institute from Cambridge, Mass. I had worked with them on a series of sea level rise task forces along the Hudson after Hurricanes Irene and Sandy. Our initial fiscal sponsor, because we're not an organization, but a coalition of groups, was the Regional Plan Association in New York City, and it is now Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress, an organization that does a lot of great data collection and analysis and put out a lot of reports about current economic, housing, social, and civic dynamics in the Hudson Valley. And if you're not familiar with their reports, I would encourage all of you to go to their website and look at them. Next slide, please. So as I said, initially it was principally about, we really didn't know where it would go, but it was about relationship and trust building. And I remember in particular a representative of one of the affordable housing groups sharing that she had a master's degree in forest stewardship or conservation biology or something, and had worked in the Peace Corps doing that work, and then had transitioned to work for an affordable housing organization. And it just began to break the ice where people around the table began to understand that everybody was sort of on the same page in their heads about what their vision and goals for the future of the Hudson Valley would be. And we created a word cloud, which is shown up here, where we fed in the mission statements of all 10 of the initial organizations participating. And it became clear that there was a lot of overlap in vision and values and mission across the organizations. With respect to climate in particular, we all know that conservation land trusts are committed to climate resilience and what people in the land trust community call community-centered conservation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And affordable housing, again, one of these sort of myths to be debunked, is not what a lot of people think of from the 1960s and 70s, these sort of tall towers in the park, but actually is about as climate smart and land use efficient as most development gets these days. It typically needs to have access to existing or planned water and sewer. Because of the subsidies it gets, it is required to meet energy efficiency and many other green building standards. It's as compact as it gets. So from a land use perspective, it's not spread out and creating fragmentation. and it's typically walkable or close to walkable to jobs, schools, and other community resources. So community-centered conservation is a concept that came out of sort of an evolution of land conservation, where early on it was primarily private landowners donating a conservation easement on their land to protect certain conservation values, and in return for which they would have the sort of sense of fulfillment, if you will, that they had done something good to conserve important resources, and they would get a tax deduction. But these projects didn't typically involve the community directly. There was no public access to the land, and it was a bit mysterious, frankly, to some people. And it also generated some pushback by others about, why this land was being sort of locked up, and the public wasn't getting direct benefit from it. So over time, we saw a lot of things happen. Organizations, land trust organizations, started creating preserves, creating parking areas and trails, starting environmental education programs, beginning to work with farmers on farmland protection, which was something new. And it continues to evolve. And when I think of community-centered conservation today, I think of it, though, not as just a land conservation organization doing something that it thinks, or even after consultation with members of the community, will sort of better the community in some way. But I think of it as conservation organizations needing to think of themselves as actual members of the community, with the same responsibilities and interdependencies that other members of the community have, working together to live in right relation with the land. And so then I think, how can a community live in right relation with the land if large numbers of people, many of whom the community relies on for its most basic functions, can't afford to live there at all? And so if we really believe that everything is connected, then maybe we need also to be thinking about what are the connections that don't exist that we can make as conservationists to begin to fill the gaps. We also often frame our work in the conservation community as being for future generations. And that's fundamental. I mean, it's key to the messaging to the public and to our constituents. But it also sometimes can cause us to look past certain current realities. So just two examples. With agriculture, we think about conserving farmland so it will always be there to be a source of providing food to local communities and to our region, and in some cases beyond. But research by the organization now becoming known as Growing Homes, formerly the Farmer Housing Working Group, did a survey of farmers and farm workers in the Hudson Valley to find that, one of the greatest threats to the continuation of farming in the Hudson Valley is the lack of housing that farmers and farm workers can actually afford to live in. And then, of course, there's climate. I think probably everyone participating in this Zoom call today knows that climate impacts aren't something to think about for the future. They are happening now and have been. But we often frame our work around climate change from a future-oriented frame. And I'll just mention, the largest single funder of our first phase of work was the Nature Conservancy of New York, which frankly, it surprised me at the time. And some of the folks from the Nature Conservancy, what they said to me was, we as a community, not just the Nature Conservancy, we're telling literally millions of people that they live in vulnerable locations in coastal areas. Of course, when we had that conversation, the California fires had not yet occurred. And we're telling them that they need to move, or they will need to move. Maybe we have a responsibility as a community also to help identify less vulnerable locations where people can move to. So I was surprised early on when we began having these conversations that perhaps the greatest point of intersection across the two sectors was around climate and around community. And that has continued to be the case. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we asked the groups to do, and it wasn't Rebecca and I or the Consensus Building Institute drafting something, but asking the organizations themselves to draft a statement of their shared purpose. Why is it that it was important to them as nonprofit affordable housing groups and conservation organizations to engage in this conversation and this work? And I thought it was going to be really challenging for them. And it turned out to not to be hardly at all. The entire shared purpose statement is on our website, but just a sort of a summary statement of it is shown on the slide here. And I'll just share that while it was very, very easy for them, much easier than I thought, to generate this shared purpose statement, there was one sticking point along the way. The affordable housing organizations thought it was going to be essential to include the word NIMBY in the shared purpose statement. And of course, we know it's sort of a charged word or phrase. And some of the folks from the conservation community who were represented were saying, yeah, we get that. We don't disagree with you, but we also want this shared purpose statement to be as inclusive as possible. And we don't want to start off by potentially alienating people, like perhaps members of our own boards of directors or some of our constituents, because we're, attaching labels, if you will, to some of the folks in our broader community. So the organizations were able to sort of wordsmith around that. So the word NIMBY is not in the shared purpose statement, but the concept of what it represents is. Next slide, please. So what is it that we're actually doing, these now 16 organizations, and where do we see this heading? So our work, some of this is sort of operational, but maybe it's of interest to all of you. The 16 organizations meet monthly via Zoom. Twice a year we meet in person, and we try to combine it with a site visit and a reception. Most recently, in June, we met in Kingston and visited with the Kingston Land Trust, the new 54-acre farm that they acquired this past year as part of their Land in Black Hands program, where they will have housing for the Black farmers who will be occupying and farming the property, followed by a reception at Keegan-Ailes, well attended, great opportunity to meet other folks and learn about what we're doing. Our next in-person meeting will be on November 17th in Poughkeepsie at Scenic Hudson's new Northside hub and headquarters. So hopefully you'll be able to join us there. So we have these monthly meetings, and we've been focusing on sort of 4 areas of work. One is actual on-the-ground collaborative projects. And that's what they first say to me. They go, so where is this new housing? And they sometimes now refer to me as the housing guy. And I say to them, no, I am not the housing guy, I'm the both guy. But there wouldn't be anything wrong with being the housing guy. And so the first and perhaps most tangible project, while there are others that are developing as well, is in Red Hook, where Scenic Hudson, the Duchess Land Conservancy, and RUPCO, a regional nonprofit affordable housing group based in Kingston, collaborated with the town of Red Hook to acquire what was the former Cookingham farm at the north end of the village. Part of the land is in the town of Red Hook and part of it in the village. And it also, I'll talk a little bit without going into too much detail about what the project involves, but one of the elements of it is that it enabled each of the two sectors to leverage the resources of the other to make it easier for them to accomplish their goal. So for this parcel, which was about 110 acres, Scenic Hudson and the Dutchess Land Conservancy worked with the town and the property owner, where the town actually acquired the farm. And then Scenic Hudson helped fund a conservation easement on about 100 acres of the total. And the land was then sold by the town to Hardy Roots Organic Farm, which is in the process of converting it to an organic operation. And Dutchess Land Conservancy, I believe, is the holder of the conservation easement on that. And the easement also includes certain covenants that will help to ensure that the land remains affordable to farmers going into the future. And then the remaining acreage, which is located in the village, RUPCO is working with the town and the village to develop 40 affordable housing units there. The plan is for 20 single family and 20 multifamily units. And one of the things that's a little wonky perhaps, but that excited me the most along the way was that for the project to proceed, it needs certain on-site infrastructure improvements. And the town and RUPCO were applying for state funding for on-site infrastructure for a housing project. And all 10 of the organizations, including all of the land trusts, signed a letter of support to the state to support funding for housing infrastructure. And I'm guessing that it's the first, or certainly one of the first instances where a group of conservation organizations submitted a letter of support for funding for housing infrastructure. There are other projects developing in Kingston. I mentioned the farm, and one in Marbletown, and one in New Lebanon, which was a different sort of collaboration, where it was the relationships that made it possible, where a local business owner wanted to convert his indoor market space to a year-round farmers market with affordable housing above, but had no idea who to call. And a representative of one of our land trusts said, hey, call this guy at Hudson River Housing, and he'll be able to work with you on this. And they are now working together to advance that project. The second area is policy solutions. And as many of you are probably aware, most municipalities in particular don't have two nickels to rub together to invest directly in either conservation projects or affordable housing projects. And some communities, and there are 3 counties in the Hudson Valley that have authorization for this, and a few communities outside of those that have secured authorization, have passed what are called community preservation funds, which is typically up to a 2% transfer fee on real estate transfers above the area median, which go into a fund that the municipality can use to invest in conservation projects. 4 towns on Long Island at the end of 2022 that already had community preservation funds secured authorization from the state to also put on their local ballot a measure creating a community housing fund. All 4 of them passed, and now those 4 communities have a stream of income that's coming in. These projects take time, but as required by the law, they now have committees that are working to create community housing plans and community preservation plans, and are thinking about how they invest in those projects, hopefully in a more integrated and inclusive way than just separately. The third area, I'm going to skip on the bullet points to communicating differently, is that, and I frankly think it's one of the most important elements of this, is how the organizations in each sector communicate to their boards of directors, to their constituents through their newsletters and social media, at their events, and how they communicate to public officials. Although they all get this idea that everything's connected to everything else, although they get and understand things like smart growth and land use decisions that are supposed to generate a more climate resilient, intact landscape, and more reliance on centralized infrastructure, it is rare, if ever, that you would hear them communicate about a successful project or initiative by a group in the other sector that was advancing these goals and accomplishing their mission at the same time. Instead, what we hear, and I do fear sometimes, that we've sort of trained our communities too well to look at every development project, no matter what it is, as something to oppose before we even think about and understand what its implications are from a land use and climate perspective. So last February, around Valentine's Day, one of our groups developed a graphic. It was shown earlier in this PowerPoint presentation, which had a heart in the middle and showed conserved land and affordable housing together. And just to sort of, as a prompt for organizations to begin to think differently about how they communicate. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'll talk about what it is. We have another working group focused on municipal engagement, because as we know, all land use in New York as a home rule state pretty much occurs at the local level. So members of the organizations from both sectors have been thinking about and taking steps to advance how municipalities can begin to think about these two essential needs in a more integrated way. And so we published a set of recommendations for housing and conservation planning. And some of the sort of key elements are, so if you're community X and you're doing a new comprehensive plan and you create typically subcommittees of the comprehensive planning group to focus on different areas, you might, I think in the past, probably a lot of Hudson Valley communities didn't even create a housing committee, let alone an affordable housing committee. But the people who were on that were typically either local developers, local officials, planners, with a focus and expertise in housing alone. And you would also, of course, have some sort of a subcommittee focused on the environment or conservation, and now these days sort of heavily leavened with climate interests. And the people who would be on that subcommittee would be open space advocates, climate advocates, land use planners, and others who have a keen interest in environmental protection and conservation. What we're suggesting is when a community creates these committees, they either create combined committees, or if they're going to have separate committees, they weave in advocates from the other sector as well, so that those conversations can create a more rationalized, holistic outcome that doesn't, in effect, set the two up as silos, which create nothing but conflict in the future. So integrating housing and conservation goals in comprehensive plans and updating zoning accordingly. I mentioned expanding community preservation and community housing fund opportunities. And then the last thing is the importance of collaborating with surrounding municipalities. And we all talk the language of environmental resources don't stop at the political border or the boundary between the village and the town, or the town and the next town. But it is rare that the committees and the people working on planning and implementation on an ongoing basis actually create operational structures to ensure that the two are working together. I want to mention one more thing about something we're doing in a very concrete way around comprehensive plans and integrating the way we think about and plan for open space and affordable housing. We are partnering with Pattern for Progress, the Pace University Land Use Law Center, and the Hudson River Estuary Program on a pilot basis with the town of New Lebanon in Columbia County. And they are anticipating doing an update to their comprehensive plan in the next year or so. And what we wanted to do was to work with the community that was sort of in that position to think about how they could integrate the two in their plan instead of standing up these two separate silos with recommendations about the importance on one hand of making sure we had adequate housing stock in our community to serve the folks that need it. And on the other hand, in a separate silo, the paramount importance of preserving, and we all know the language, our rural character, our landscape intact, our biodiversity, our climate resilience to build that. And then when the plan is adopted, when a proposal comes in for one or the other, it will, as I said before, often set up a conflict instead of the community having worked through that in advance and identified certain places where there's consensus that it's appropriate for housing development to meet certain needs, or it's appropriate and desirable to achieve that not patchwork conservation, but longer term connected conservation outcome. And hopefully in some places, like the Red Hook example, actually accomplish both together. So we are in the middle of that process now with the town of New Lebanon. And if it's successful and if we can secure funding going forward, we hope to be able to replicate it in other Hudson Valley communities that show interest. Last thing, I said that was the last thing, but I have one more. When it comes to sort of changing the conversation and debunking myths and sharing information about the two sectors. One experience we had here a little over a year ago in Rhinebeck, where I live, was that the pastor of the local Episcopal church saw that housing affordability was a major concern in our community. And he actually secured a grant from the Episcopal church to hold a series of community conversations about, in this case, it was focused on housing, but it brought in land use on a larger scale. And instead of holding it at town hall, being hosted by the town supervisor or another town board member, it was at the church social hall with the pastor moderating the conversation over 4 Sundays with presentations followed by potluck dinners. We had 80 to 100 people in the small village of Rhinebeck attending each one of the 4 sessions. And instead of, again, it being in town hall and potentially becoming heated and maybe having a little less of the civil discourse we all value, because of the setting, because of who was moderating the conversation, and I think how the presentations were made, it was a much different environment within which to share information, to understand the history of these issues in a particular community, and to enable the residents of the community to leave these meetings with a much more shared common frame of reference about the importance of housing needs and how it relates to their interest in also ensuring that conservation values are held close and taken seriously. Anyway, with that, I will open it up for any questions or discussions. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Folks, we have lots of time for discussion. So if you have a question, you're welcome to either pop it in the chat or come unmute yourself and ask a question. I just wanted to maybe kick us off with a follow-up to the Cookingham Farm project in Red Hook, Steve. And I wanted to see if you could connect it back to what you were saying about how there was a perception that that conserved land is sort of not part of the public good in a way. It's not as directly experienced except by maybe the property owner. And so I was wondering if you could speak to some of the other elements in the Cookingham Farm project beyond affordable housing and the farmland. I think they have some other ways that people who live in Red Hook can experience that land or get some other benefit from it.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that they may have already launched this past summer, but they intend to launch a summer camp for kids there. I think they intend for the food that's produced at the farm to become directly available to the residents of the affordable housing project in a more direct way than just in the general marketplace. You may know of other
Yeah.
benefits
Well, I was
than
thinking
I
of
do.
there's also walking paths that are open to the public through the farm. And I think they're also adding a small solar array that the town would own. Um, so yeah, just like additional other uses if you have a parcel that lends itself to different aspects that kind of can open people's eyes to, oh, this is a communal benefit. It's not just for the people who live there or just for the farmer, but
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Although those improvements for the solar project and the trail are on the opposite side of the road on a different part of the farm. So that wasn't directly involved in the project that
okay.
the alliance groups were part of.
Okay, great. How about Kate? Kate Butler.
Hi, yeah. My town is actually working on a natural resource inventory. And when we embarked on this about a year ago, the thought popped into my head that we should be mapping out places that would be maybe less ecologically significant or valuable, or, just figuring out how to integrate locating areas for affordable housing as we're doing this. I know it can't kind of be part of the NRI, but it kind of has to be part of our overall planning documents. I'm wondering how you would integrate, or if you had recommendations of how you would integrate that. Like, I don't, like, my community has a sense of where we'd like to place things, but maybe not a practical sense of, some of the other things like soils, where you can get good septic, where you can get good water, that sort of thing.
Right, great question. And one other thing I would encourage your committee to do, and Vanessa's familiar with this because we had conversations about it in Rhinebeck with a natural resource inventory and an open space plan, is that oftentimes the final plans will include a series of maps, which are terrific, which show the wetlands and the steep slopes and the forest blocks and the waterways. But they typically don't include parcel boundaries. And so they can give a very different picture of what the sort of security, if you will, of those conservation resources looks like and what might be involved in permanently protecting them. Because if you have a single or two or three parcels that combined make up a large conservation resource in the community, it's much easier to try to conserve that and much less expensive typically than if you have that same resource that's already been subdivided into a dozen or 15 different private ownerships. So I would really encourage you to make sure that you show parcel lines. It also is important because it helps to communicate that typically our communities have zoning in rural areas that is all residential and typically somewhere between 2 and 20 acres per subdivision. And if that is the rule, then basically each community has basically set up a prescription for the complete fragmentation of its landscape. Of course, there are lots of planning and zoning tools to try to minimize that, conservation subdivisions and others. But I would just say, with respect to your question, specifically that, and it sounds similar in some way to the exercise we're going through in New Lebanon, that if the community can identify places where it thinks, because it's located maybe adjacent to existing hamlet or village centers, or is otherwise sort of makes sense as a housing location, that you first identify those, you sort of look at the multiple tax parcels that would be included in making a development occur in such a location, and then do the same sort of overlays that you would do typically around wetlands and steep slopes and other environmental constraints to determine whether those constraints are too great or whether it makes it would make sense and be a rational approach and help the community to develop that in a different way.
Thank you. Heather, did you have your hand up?
It did, but I'm kind of reformulating
Okay.
my question. I mean, since I'm here, I can ask. I mean, I sort of think about a house as human habitat, but I feel like a lot of time we still don't sort of see ourselves that way. We still see ourselves very separate from nature. And so I think my question is around how do we bring nature kind of inside of a habitat? Like, how do we actually sort of combine? So, for example, like maybe you just have a place where you could have like a little indoor garden for sprouts or something. You can make that as common as having a stove or a refrigerator. Or maybe you just have like an assumed garden plot. You can do earth boxes, which are very simple to use. And so just wondering, if you work with any sort of developers or architects who are thinking that way.
So the individual organizations work typically directly with developers and designers, or with architects and designers and engineers. And the question sort of raises the question of scale a lot. So you can look at the scale from like within an individual dwelling and it's sort of the lot or plot that it's on, or you can step back and look at a village or hamlet scale, or you can step back and look at a town scale or a county scale, or even the region. And I think, of course, the kinds of things you're talking about can be and should be woven into developments, but I don't think it's necessary to make sure that, for example, every individual dwelling unit has its own private, personal, natural paradise. Because the risk is that then across a larger scale, you've lost the paradise at scale because you've created like a conservation subdivision. Let's say you have, a community has a conservation subdivision ordinance that says if you're going to develop any parcel bigger than X acres, at least 50% of it has to be undeveloped and preserved. So with that individual 50-acre parcel, maybe that's a good conservation outcome. You've conserved half of the site and people are living on the other half. But if that is replicated across the town and those conserved bits of each of these parcels don't relate directly to what's been conserved in the other, then you basically have subdivided your town and have probably what's going to look like suburban development spread across the town with patchworks of green in between here and there. And so I'm not dissing conservation subdivisions. I'm just suggesting that there needs to be a sense of maybe a 50,000-foot view of how what's happening on individual parcels adds up over time at a larger scale.
Just curious if your group, Steve, if the Alliance has done any sort of mapping that kind of could show the evolution of our region at that level if we don't do anything, or on the other hand, if we do.
Yeah, the only great question, thanks, Vanessa. The mapping that we did, and it's on our website, and sometimes, unfortunately, I think it's taken to be more meaningful than it actually is. The process was almost as important as the outcome, was that as a way for the organizations in both sectors to learn about the challenges that they faced and how they did their projects and what was necessary to create a successful project. I think anybody who's in conservation knows that protecting an important conservation resource doesn't just happen. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it involves all sorts of expertise around real estate and land use and politics. With all that said, creating a successful affordable housing project, from what I've learned, is much more complicated, and the financing structure and the time and dealing with public perception along the way to get it to the finish line. So what we did at the beginning was we put the groups together, and for the groups in each sector, we said, what are the factors that need to be in place to have a successful project? And then our initial fiscal sponsor, the Regional Plan Association based in New York City, did a GIS mapping exercise where they gathered as much objective data that was available digitally. And, by the way, but not for nothing, you can't get comprehensive data on existing water and sewer infrastructure and capacity in our Hudson Valley community. So it's very difficult to do that sort of strategic view of how things might change in the future based on current conditions. But the organizations working with the data that was available and their own knowledge of the politics and dynamics in different communities mapped out what they considered to be the places in the Hudson Valley and the 6 counties that were most conducive to collaborative on-the-ground projects. And so one might look at the map and it might say that Town X is one of those communities. That should not be interpreted to mean that it's a green light, go in, you can do a project tomorrow. But that map does exist. Dutchess County Planning over the years has done some great mapping along those lines to show areas of the county, not surprisingly, sort of moving up like a giant amoeba from south to north, where land has been used more intensively and suburbanization has occurred. And Pattern for Progress has also recently, in some of their reports, done similar mapping.
Okay, thank you. Bradley, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all this information, Steve. I'm wondering, I guess along the lines of communities not feeling the benefit of conservation, I'm concerned that in conservation easements, we're often undercutting the tax base for the schools through those tax credits. So I'm wondering if you've seen any projects that are trying to avoid that. Yeah, it seems like a significant impact that I don't hear people talking about.
Well, it's a great question. Everyone should be aware that the law in New York does not require local assessors to reduce the assessed value of a property just because it has a conservation easement on it. What we always shared with property owners who couldn't certainly make, when I was at Scenic Hudson, any representations to them that they would be entitled to a particular reduction in their assessment. They certainly, if they had a good appraisal of what the conservation easement impact would be on the value of the property, they had a good conversation with the assessor awaiting them. When certain communities in the Hudson Valley, just through history, have a great deal of land that's already off the tax rolls because it's large religious or institutional properties, certain communities more than others. The town of Esopus, for example, on the riverfront in Ulster County has tremendous amount of land that was and still is owned by religious and other institutional owners. At the time when we were coming under fire, when we were acquiring lands for conservation that we were planning to open to the public, but that would come off the tax rolls. When we did the analysis to look at what the impact on the tax rolls overall would be relative to properties that were already off the tax rolls, it was pretty minimal. So I think the key is really to look at the facts in the community you're working in to determine whether it really is, maybe it's a red herring. The biggest, I think, no, I shouldn't say the biggest, a big concern, if you listen to Adam Bosch, who's the CEO of Pattern for Progress, he will say, I think that last I heard from him over the past recent history, the Hudson Valley has lost 48,000 public school students. What we're reading about, to your point about the importance of having a tax base that supports public education, what we need more than anything is school kids right now, because our schools are closing and are working right on the edges of economic viability. And unfortunately, when a well-conceived affordable housing project comes up, you'll hear people complaining that it's just going to add kids to the school, when in fact the schools are have the lowest populations they've had in a long time. So I'm not discounting your concern that property come off the tax rolls could undercut the tax base. But I think in reality, it may not add up to be as significant as some might think it is.
Okay, thank you.
How about Anya?
Thanks, Steve. I learned a lot from your talk. I this may be a unanswerable question, but I was really encouraged to hear that all these conversations are happening and there's, these different mechanisms that our municipality could consider. But I also, as somebody who's, faced some of these challenges personally and also work at the public library, I understand that there's kind of an urgency, I think, for a lot of families. Even since I've lived in Cloudbrook in the last like 4 years, I feel like it's changed significantly. You mentioned our median home price going up so much just in a year's time. So my question, I guess, is about timing, because my sense, and maybe I'm wrong, is that some of these uh, planning mechanisms will take quite a long time to be able to kind of come to fruition. So just wondered if there are things that our community can do, or maybe our county or whatever, um, on a shorter time scale to kind of meet people in this tricky intersection.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Anya. Both of these are urgent matters, and no affordable housing project will focus on those because that's what you primarily, I think, are asking about. Happens overnight, but it's and there's no sort of magic wand to wave. The factors have to do with land costs, with construction costs, with community perceptions, with the complicated nature of the financing structures for these projects, to what isn't allowed from a septic perspective, the massive underinvestment in water and sewer infrastructure in our community centers, which are needed to have a development of any scale. But it's why I think the communication piece is so important, that we talk, for example, if you're a town supervisor under the sort of current or sort of recent political dynamics and social dynamics in our communities, and some housing developer comes in and says, I want to build 80 affordable housing units for the people who work in your hospital and work in your schools and the post office and the painters and the plumbers and your kids who went away to college and can't afford to come home, and the elders who are stuck in their big houses because they can't find a smaller place to go to. If we begin to communicate with one another and with those local officials differently, that we're welcoming of those, that we understand that put in the right places and with a small, tight footprint and as part of our community, we really need this. And it's actually a strategy that helps to conserve the surrounding countryside. And I used to talk about how different it would be if that affordable housing developer went in to talk to the supervisor alone versus if they were accompanied with a staff person from the local land trust. And together they were talking to that supervisor about how we need both, and how the land trust, it would be supportive, and it would communicate to its constituents that this is a good thing in this location and we need it. That might ease things. There's a project in my community, and they're true across the region, where affordable housing developers have been in front of town boards and planning boards and village boards for close to a decade trying to get approvals for projects. And if the other problems around financing can be solved and good housing developers, affordable housing developers can do that, then the primary thing facing them is community reception. So I think that's where we collectively potentially have more power than we've exercised in the past.
Yeah, and Steve, maybe you could talk about how after in Rhinebeck we had those gatherings at the church parish hall, the potlucks, that a group of people would then show up at the planning board hearing, right? And wearing green t-shirts and showing up in favor of the housing developer.
No, that's absolutely right. A group of folks got together and realized that, in fact, the town's comprehensive plan identified a handful of parcels immediately adjacent to the village, walkable, tying into existing village water and sewer, across the street, essentially from the park and the library, sort of checking all the boxes of good, smart growth. Yet the process was taking forever, and at a town board meeting a couple of years ago, it was packed and there was practically a fist fight. But after these conversations at the church, as Vanessa said, a group of people got together saying, we need to come together as a community in support of this project. And so planning boards aren't used to hearing groups of people showing up for housing projects saying we want it and we want it faster, not that we want you to slow it down and cut it in half. And so planning boards play very important roles and make projects better, and seeker is critically important, but those should not be blocks to good projects.
Yeah.
Steve, I wonder if you could help us visualize the ideal design a little more than you have already. Vanessa was talking about, in answer to your mentioning how it can be helpful to the community, certain projects like walking paths, and you were talking about farming in one. And then you were talking about how, splitting it into 50 acres that's conserved and 50 that is not a great idea. How you were also mentioning like there are characteristics of addressing both housing and conservation at once. I'm just wondering some more examples so we can imagine, what would the design of that look like? How does it answer both best?
Yeah, thanks, Paige. And it's both easy and impossible to answer. I think the Red Hook example is probably one that when I first talk to people about this concept of the two together, it's something like the Red Hook example that people are if people find most easy to wrap their heads around. Okay, you have a piece of land, part of it's going to be used for housing and part of it's going to be used for conservation. But it might be that a community already has, through the benefit of hard work and perseverance by a local land trust and others in the community over time, a fair amount of already conserved land. And next to or very near that already conserved land are parcels that don't have off the charts conservation values, that are suitable in different configurations for housing that would work and support community needs. Focus on those places and think about them in conjunction with trails that already exist. We have this other dynamic, of course, that many are familiar with, where if you try to introduce a rail trail, for example, into an existing community, the neighboring landowners all scream, and then 10 years later, they're all thrilled because their house is worth more because they live next to the rail trail and know there haven't been people breaking into their garage because they were riding their bike by on the rail trail. But so it's all different configurations. The Kingston Land Trust farm in Kingston, adjacent to the farm, the city of Kingston and Scenic Hudson conserved what they call, I think it's called the Kingston Wilderness Property. And on the farm, as I said, the farm itself is going to be, it had been let go for years, is going to be revitalized in a much more ecologically sound way in terms of the way agriculture is treated and managed there. And they will have housing on the farm for the farm workers. Another thing that will help are images of what affordable housing actually is and what it isn't. Habitat of Columbia Green in Columbia Green counties has a pilot project that they've just completed of a small sort of starter home for single family that can be constructed for, I think it was under $240,000, which is unheard of these days. And they're doing a new model, which is a little bit larger, that would be also very affordably constructed. They are working with a land trust to try to conserve a parcel adjacent to an existing housing development. In Kingston, Rupco owns a project that is on a parcel that has 9 or 10 acres that are wooded and undeveloped, but for which Rupco has no expertise or resources to develop for public access. And the building that they've already redeveloped and is fully occupied is a reuse of a historic structure that has its tremendous success. But there's this opportunity on its back doorstep, literally, that they haven't been able to take advantage of. So partnering with a conservation organization or the city to introduce public access to that could be achievable. Another project across the river, Land Trust acquired, I think it was 90 acres. The town was interested in 15 of it for some level of development, including affordable housing. And so the Land Trust in advance worked with the town to make sure that the separate 15 acres could be transferred to the town so that it could be used for other purposes. The challenging thing is we don't have a lot of pictures of completed projects at this point to share with people.
Great, but that's so helpful. Thank you for those visuals and an understanding of really what it might look like and is looking like. Appreciate it.
We had a question from Simon in the chat. He said, can you address the potential for using the development of a generic environmental impact statement, a GEIS, as an approach for planning and completing some seeker review for a project or a set of projects in an integrated way? This could potentially help attract the right organizations and perhaps businesses to collaborate with the municipality on a project with housing and conservation.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I do not profess to be a seeker law or mechanics expert, but I do think you're onto something with that. Another thing, and so I think it is possible, especially as a result of a comprehensive planning and rezoning effort that has integrated the sort of conceptualization, if you will, of the two needs together, to then do a generic impact statement where the requisite homework has been done in advance about environmental resources that could be at risk and infrastructure needs to sort of lay the groundwork for the development of affordable housing projects and more conservation efforts. But I shouldn't say more because I'm not an expert on seeker.
Okay. I had a thought, and I know you mentioned Pattern for Progress and your collaboration with them. Is wondering if they or any other organization has done a study for like how many units of housing do we need in the Hudson Valley? Just to, I know we're playing catch up here, but like
Right.
ideally, what are we talking about? Like, I know a lot of the folks on the call are from, small towns, pretty, usually typically under population of 10,000 people, pretty rural. So like, what's the scale that we're talking about for our towns? Do you
Yeah,
know?
really good question. And I think there's, it's also potentially a double-edged sword. But the state, a couple of years ago, Governor Hochul proposed this housing compact, which met with a firestorm of pushback. We can debate the reasons for that, but and created the Housing Smart Communities program. And I think Columbia County now is about to become, or maybe the only county in the state where every town has voted to become a housing smart community. But as part of the governor's proposal, I believe that there was some calculation on a town by town basis of what was needed based on housing costs and incomes. And, you're right. I mean, in the smaller towns, it's not nothing. I mean, maybe it's somewhere between 40 and 200 housing units or something like that. But if you look at recent memory, 40 to 200 housing units don't just happen overnight. And probably what we in the conservation community don't want to see is those housing units be sort of a patchwork of things across the countryside that are tearing apart the landscape. So the numbers are not huge for most of our communities. They are probably achievable with the right planning and zoning and interest. In New Lebanon, we're going to be inviting a group of developers in, not to focus on specific parcels, but to share with the community, these are the things that need to be in place for us to do a successful project, just as an information item. I think the flip side is, which is a problem with affordable housing projects getting advanced in general in any region across the country these days, is if you say, oh, we only need, X number of units, and it's really not that many, then people go, okay, fine, put them over there in that other town. Why do we need them here? People can, come from there. And then you also hear things, of course, anytime a project is proposed, well, who's actually going to live in this? It's got to be for our community, people who already live here. Well, the fact of the matter is a lot of the workers and others you want this to serve don't already live there because they can't afford to. You want them to be able to move into the community. So we just need to be careful with the numbers, and instead, I think regionally about the need and encourage, back to sort of Anya's question, how can we accelerate this? If we come up with reasons to push it to other communities, or to say it's not an urgent matter here, we won't get to the goal. And again, I am not speaking to you guys as the housing guy. I am not here to say, and there's also a bright line between sort of folks who believe that it's all about supply and we just need more housing, period. I think that from an environmental perspective is potentially very risky, as opposed to a thoughtful approach that identifies the right places in conjunction with conservation needs. And affordable housing in particular, serving, frankly, most of the people who live in our communities or would like to live in our communities these days, but who can't at the current prices.
Anya, go ahead.
I think this might connect to what you were just saying about how much housing is needed. I wondered if you could touch on the potential conservation value, or maybe it's not of conservation value, to restore houses that are in really bad shape. We have a lot of housing like that in our area.
One of the greatest, as I understand it, the greatest places of loss of existing housing is housing that's fallen into disrepair. And the greenest development going is reusing an existing building typically, as opposed to starting from scratch. So it all depends on the facts and circumstances of the individual structure and dwelling and what's involved. But more often than not, I would guess that redeveloping dilapidated or outdated housing would be a win. One other thing I just wanted to mention, and relates to Vanessa's earlier question as well, is a lot of people say, well, if the population of the region is not growing, if we're losing school kids, so where's the demand? Where do we need? Why do we even need more housing? And one thing that we're also probably all aware of is that the typical size of a household has diminished dramatically. So it used to be you could house more people with fewer houses because each household had more people in it. Used to be a typical household was 4 or 5 or 6 people. Today, a typical new household might be 1, 2, or 3 people. So you need more housing units to house the same number of people. And we also, of course, as we're all aware, the Hudson Valley is experiencing an influx of people from other regions. And forgot what I was going to say. Sorry, Anya, you were going to ask something more.
Oh, no, that's great. I was just wondering if those conversations are happening like within the Alliance, like has more emphasis been put on building new housing, or are both happening, like those kind of conversations?
Within the Alliance, we try not to get into the question of who the housing is for, or what the best thing is. It's really for the organizations that are doing the projects on the ground to use their expertise based on the particular location and dynamics and zoning and everything else to figure out what the best thing is to do. So we don't generally do that, but we do have, I just thought of it, some really fruitful and interesting conversations. You're all probably aware that the state just adopted new regulations around wetlands. The, sort of housing community writ large is very upset about this, because even though those wetlands always have existed, they weren't mapped and identified by the state as wetlands. And in fact, while they sort of may be known, what's being required now is that new mapping on any particular site occur. And this can take months and months and a lot of money to accomplish. So we had within the Alliance representatives who formerly worked at the DEC and were part of the whole process of developing the wetlands regulations, and others from the housing community who had a parcel they were trying to develop for years and are now being told that because of development on the neighboring parcel, they were required to sort of push the water off of their parcel to the neighboring parcel, where there's now a wetland that never existed before, and their housing project may be stymied. So conversations about this have been helping to gain better understanding and shared strategies. So now representatives of both sectors are hoping to go up to Albany to talk with folks at DEC about solutions that can be mutually beneficial.
Kate.
Yeah, so my community has a water source protection plan that kind of says, all right, well, your allowable zoning in a lot of the areas is going to kind of overload the land because of septic and everything. And I'm just sort of wondering if in any of your discussions you've ever talked about composting toilets or septics or anything, or is that too radical? We discussed this in Climate Smart, that could be a potential solution, because it seems to me that sometimes septic can be limiting.
Absolutely. Nothing is too radical to consider, Kate. And composting toilets is far from the most radical thing. But small scale development, agricultural, housing, and rural housing in particular often will never happen if we wait for central municipal water and sewer infrastructure. The state has, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this, but has authorized these highly efficient, better engineered septic systems that can serve multiple units. But each county health department has to approve it at the county level as well. And my understanding is, for example, that Columbia County has approved it and it's being tested now and being used. Dutchess County has not. And so I don't believe there's any particular concern about these systems, but they haven't been approved yet. And that can be one of the major impediments to being able to build small scale, affordable housing in the right locations. Something very interesting that came out of the Farmer Housing Working Group is, I think a lot of us conceive of housing for farmers and agricultural workers as being located on the farm, when in fact, I think most of us wouldn't necessarily want to live in the middle of the farm where we were working every day. Maybe we'd want to have friends and community that weren't surrounded by the farm where we were working. We'd like to live in a real place. And the survey that they did bore that out.
Steve, are there any federal rollbacks or anything impacting the affordable housing development and or the energy efficiency, green aspects of these developments? Do you know if there's any
You may know more about the energy efficiency. My sense is that a lot of those things are being rolled back. as well as some of the funding that would enable affordable housing developers who own and manage affordable housing units to be able to maintain them effectively over time, which is, of course, one of the largest costs of keeping affordable housing going. In terms of construction, I don't want to state anything categorically because I'll get it wrong. I'm not an expert on it, but I do believe that the low income tax credit program, which is referred to as LIHTC, is, I believe, essentially intact at this point. But I'm certain that there are other programs and initiatives, especially as it might relate to climate and greening of structures that might be at risk.
Okay. Well, we just have a few minutes left, so maybe we could just end on one final note, Steve. If folks in this Zoom are really resonating with the Alliance's approach, and they want to support your efforts, or they want to try to urge this similar approach in their own towns, what final parting words of wisdom do you have?
Well, I would say, first of all, I would just encourage you to speak to your friends and neighbors and local officials in your community about it in maybe a different way than you have in the past, based on this conversation, if that's helpful. Feel free to reach out to me, or you probably know people in a number of the organizations that are part of the Alliance, and talk with them about it. If there are opportunities in your community or something you see as an opportunity, let your local land trust or one of the affordable housing groups know about it. And if you would like, join our mailing list, our email list. We don't send you out much, but we do a quarterly e-newsletter, and we have these twice a year events. And if Vanessa or Paige, if you give them the authorization to share your emails with us, I will have you added to our list. But I just want to thank you again, Vanessa and Paige, and all of you for participating and listening and being part of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, take care, everybody. We'll see you
Bye-bye.
back online soon. Bye.